They told me, in the bland, officious font of the homeowner association's email templates, that my cabin's exterior paint was not in compliance. They didn't write Karen anywhere in that first notice. They didn't need to. The signature line read Heron Pines HOA Board, but we all knew the board was Karen. Karen was the sort of woman who carried a leather-bound notebook like a talisman, who had once lectured a mail carrier for folding a package wrapper the wrong way. She was the president of our little HOA, a woman with an almost pathological need to be obeyed, and a talent for turning the HOA's petty rules into a form of civic theater. For 3 years, I had thought of Heron Pines as an escape, a small cedar cabin I bought after my divorce because I liked the honest smell of wood and the way loons sounded across the lake in late September. I liked that the cabin was unloved by interior designers and beloved by me. I liked that the neighbors waved when they mowed their lawns and left me to my books. I liked that I could turn off my phone and pretend the urgent email of the world didn't exist. And then I told Karen no. Her weekend was how she phrased it, as if she owned a calendar that entitled her to 3-day invasions of other people's property. It began innocently enough. She'd called a small neighborhood gathering because she wanted to bring the board back to nature, which translated into an elaborate weekend of potluck, paddleboarding, and a bonfire she insisted on hosting on the little public beach by my cabin. I was not on the board. I had no duty to attend. But when she suggested she might set up her tent back by your place because my cabin had a deck perfect for the elderly in her crowd, I said no. It was my private deck, my private property, my intention to spend a Saturday morning with coffee and a book, not a parade of over-caffeinated volunteers. When she dropped the board can arrange alternate locations line, I thought the matter closed. Then the email arrived. The paint complaint. My trim wasn't exactly the approved trim color word. That had never been enforced when I replaced a gutter 2 summers ago. And my neighbor across the way had a deck the color of a grapefruit that the board's emails described as charming. But the message was clear, either repaint or face fines. I replied with a short paragraph explaining that the trim was weathered cedar, not paint. It was intentional and within the spirit of the covenants. I also reminded them politely that the covenants allowed for aesthetic discretion at the board's discretion. That was the kind of bureaucratic circularity that usually meant you'd get a polite note and then life would go on, but Karen escalated. She called. "You can't have people sleeping out back," she said in a tone that made it sound like I'd set up a homeless encampment. She used the phrase common area rights, as though those rights belonged to her personally. I explained the law calmly. Homeowners can't be displaced without due process. The board could issue a temporary revocation of beach privileges only if there were a hazard. She didn't hear me. "I can make your life difficult," she said, with the thin, theatrical calm of someone trying on menace and finding it fit perfectly. I should have let it go. I should have replied with another email, forwarded it to the board, and let the standard HOA machinery take its slow, corrective course. But this was Karen. She wouldn't let it go. She turned the complaint into a crusade. A week later, she sent a blistering letter suggesting my cabin be inspected for non-compliant use, because apparently people were coming and going at odd hours. This was the sort of thing that slack litters a small town's gossip chain. Coffee clatches murmured about those cabin types and how they let anyone sleep over. I felt the irritation rise into a steady, hot determination. I am a lawyer by trade. I used to work in mediation and compliance, and I understand the power of procedure. I also had a small but very useful hobby. I built and managed networks, cabin routers, mesh systems, little smart home projects I'd cobbled together to keep my heating low and my music high. For years, those skills had been dormant outside of passive use, a tinkering I did between court filings and mornings of iced coffee. In the face of Karen's escalating tyranny, they became the tools I would use to reclaim what was mine. What they didn't know, I wrote back. What Karen didn't know was that I keep meticulous records. Receipts, photos, calendars, voice memos. Not because I intended to fight anyone, but because I hated uncertainty. And now, the uncertainty was theirs. I asked the board, properly and politely this time, to document the alleged violations and produce the complaint in full. I asked them to name the complainant. According to HOA rules, anonymous complaints were not to be accepted without corroborating evidence. The email response was a single line. We have received various complaints and are investigating. It read like a sealed threat, so I began to collect what would later be called my evidence. Though I did not see it as evidence then, it was only the daily life of defending a small piece of peace. I walked the property and photographed the trim, the beach access, the deck boards. I logged who had visited and when. I asked my friends who might be on odd hours to text a simple "here" when they arrived and "gone" when they left. I recorded the sound of the property lines. I took the long night tape of a neighbor's late evening party to prove noise was incidental, not criminal. But most importantly, I started paying attention to people. Where Karen was a tyrant, she was predictable. Angry when unattended, performative when given applause. She loved being in control of the narrative and would commit to dramatics that made her feel validated. That predictability would be her undoing. I posted, privately and carefully, "Here's a problem, have you had anything related?" and watched as the cluster around my cabin quietly aligned. The insider crouched at the edges of neighborhood politics. Elena, who once worked on a city zoning board, emailed me that Karen had a habit of quietly bending covenants to favor people she liked. The expert, my friend Marco, a cybersecurity guy who delivered sandwiches on weekends, suggested simple but effective steps I could take to make an HOA investigation unravel into a spectacle. The moral support was a neighbor named Josiah, who had built a life of sensible retorts and low-volume protests, and who offered his dock for an alternate picnic. Everyone advised caution. Everyone said that a fight with the HOA often meant legal fees and reputations burned, but also everyone said the same thing in quieter tones. Something about Karen made them want to see her stopped. I didn't start with revenge. I started with a calm, methodical plan: document, push, and let the procedure reveal itself for what it was: weaponized etiquette. That night I laid out, on paper, what it would take to bring the issue into the light. I would need a timeline. I would need corroboration. I would need proof that any alleged beach occupant was either invited or within the rights granted to me as a property owner. And most of all, I would need to expose the pattern of arbitrary enforcement that had long been the board's quiet culture. What they didn't know was that I used boredom as a tool. I would make the inevitable face-off look like an absurd theater piece even a jury would laugh at. I made a small joke to myself as I packed the camera and the router into my satchel. If Karen wanted theater, I'd give her a show. I asked a small rhetorical question into the email thread I sent to the board that night: "When will your investigation conclude?" It was a harmless little nudge meant to invite formality, to make them commit to a timeline. It would also become the bait that pulled Karen out into the open. The first formal step, an HOA meeting called under the pretense of community well-being, arrived like a thunderclap on my quiet Saturday morning. An invitation signed by board chair and stamped with the association's official crest. Karen's handwriting hadn't evolved to font. She still liked to make signatures that looked like the trail a hawk's talon would make if it signed a check. The agenda read blandly: review of recent complaints, determination of compliance, vote regarding usage of common areas. I RSVP'd because rules matter. And because it's harder for a tyrant to escalate when their instrument of escalation is written down and witnessed. The meeting was packed. Part of that was thanks to Karen's flair for drama. Part of it was the quiet curiosity of cabin owners who treat neighborhood politics like a small-town soap opera. I arrived early and took a seat in the back. There was a low murmur, the rustling of folding chairs, the soft clink of coffee cups. Karen arrived like a captain. She had rallied a small battalion, a woman who ran an interior design presentation group, and a retired postmaster with a face carved from decades of administrative duty. They sat at the front, a little island of smugness. When the meeting was called to order, Karen read from a prepared script that suggested the HOA's actions were in the public interest. She spoke of fairness to all homeowners and upholding our covenants. She made the word community sound like an incantation. Then she introduced the complaint, an anonymous note, claiming that strangers had been camping on the beach next to my cabin, that there had been unauthorized use of the property during board-sanctioned events. I watched her as she spoke. Her face held the practiced calm of an actor on opening night. People murmured. Some nodded, others looked over at me. I stood up and said, calmly and plainly, that the claim was unfounded. I told the assembly that the beach in question was accessible to property owners and that I had hosted small gatherings, always informally and always within covenants. People who didn't know me might have labeled me defensive, but my voice didn't tremble. I spoke like a mediator, not like someone pleading for mercy. Karen's eyes narrowed. She called me dismissive and insisted that the board had a duty to investigate any potential misuse, even if the complainant wished to remain anonymous. I bowed my head slightly and suggested the same board follow its own rulebook. A complaint would be accepted only with 2 corroborating witnesses or physical evidence. There are moments in community meetings when the machinery of bureaucracy either grinds or smooths. At that meeting, it groaned. Karen, feeling the call to theater, insisted on a vote to temporarily restrict beach access to owner families only until an investigation concluded. That phrasing was intentionally vague, designed to put the burden on me by redefining family, according to committee whim. I opposed the motion, calmly listing the details. The beach was a communal area. The covenants gave the board no unreviewable veto power. Temporary restrictions require a 2/3 vote and documented cause. The room became a breathhold. A few people looked unsure. Some protested that we must preserve peace. The vote was put to the floor. Under normal slow circumstances, votes like this fail. People are lazy and prefer not to rock boats. But Karen had marshaled her forces. She'd sent a couple of emails the week before reminding people to attend and lend their voice to community standards. She had brought pastries. She had brought her own gravitas. The motion passed by a thin margin, just enough that the board issued an emergency order restricting beach usage pending further formal review. As they read the order aloud, a woman behind me made a soft sound of indignation that people didn't usually make at HOA meetings. That was where the escalation took a practical turn. The emergency order now had the weight of paper and signatures. It meant that, for the foreseeable weekend, no one could use the beach without prior authorization. That authorization would be dispensed by the very board that had just voted to restrict those rights. Now I was angry, but anger wasn't the engine of my plan. Method was. When reasonable channels are exhausted, you do what you must. You show the world what the unreasonable looks like. I met with Elena, the zoning insider, who told me that arbitrary enforcement like this, restricting common areas without demonstrable cause, was exactly the sort of thing homeowners had successfully challenged in small claims, and sometimes even in civil court. She also warned that the public perception of such actions could go either way. A neighbor who looks like a recluse can be easily colored as problematic. We devised a strategy that included a public record request for all communications between board members about this complaint, photographic evidence of the beach usage, and an account of previous enforcement actions to prove pattern. Marco, the cybersecurity friend, suggested we document the timeline with time-stamped photos and a metadata preserving app, so there was no question about when and where an image had been taken. He also suggested a petty but effective tactical move: create a small sign-in sheet for visitors to my cabin and have people sign with the time they arrived and left. Simple things like a logbook can transform anonymous allegations into factual contradictions. I established small protocols. Friends who arrived for coffee that weekend would text "here" and "gone." I placed a small, outward-facing diary on my porch and asked guests to sign it. It felt ridiculous, like something from a sitcom, but when the HOA moved to punish, silliness becomes proof. Every time Karen escalated with a letter, I responded with a polite, documented request for evidence. The board seemed to run on the idea that their will alone was a kind of evidence. The more they insisted they had various complaints, the more I suspected they were consolidating power by manufacturing chaos. I wanted to show that the chaos was theirs, not mine. The escalation didn't stop at a paper order. It became personal. A neighbor named Ruth, an elderly widow who had never had trouble in the community, called me, distressed. She came to my house, Ruth whispered, and said if you were hosting people, she would have to report it to the county. It turned out Karen had been making house calls. Soft threats that used fear of government as leverage. That was the moment I knew this had become larger than a narrow dispute about a deck. This was about the way a person with the right tone and the right access could create regulation by intimidation. Standing on my porch with the neighbor's logbook in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, I felt two things: the coldness of being targeted and the certainty that Karen's methods, if exposed, would not survive scrutiny. She had built her power on the assumption that owners would prefer quiet compliance over the mess of confrontation. She underestimated the willingness of people to document, to insist on procedure, and above all, to have a little fun with the concept of civic justice. The next phase of the plan was slow and deliberate. Convert irritation into documentation, make the motion into a machine. We would force the board to reveal its internal processes and then televise the ridiculousness of their internal processes back at them. In the space between the emergency order and whatever formal investigation would follow, I prepared the stage for the main event. The formal hearing where Karen would have to justify her actions in front of a crowd and an official record. There was a peculiar solidarity that gathered around the edges of my mailbox in the days after the emergency order. People who had been silent at the meeting suddenly found their voices in small, practical ways. Sarah, the yoga instructor, 2 cabins down, started holding classes on the dock at scheduled times and told each student to sign the porch log before they came. A group of teenagers who liked the lake posted playful videos where they set up imaginative beach clubs and labeled them "Owner Families Only lol." Ruth, the widow who'd been intimidated, called the county herself and asked what reporting would even look like. The county clerk answered, kindly and with a hint of exasperation, that an HOA has no authority to call county enforcement for a mere picnic. The most effective support came from 2 unlikely places. First, a retired local journalist named Tom reached out. He'd won a prize years ago for local reporting and still liked a good story about bureaucrats behaving badly. He offered to attend the next meeting and to ask pointed questions. Second, an online neighborhood forum, a place usually reserved for lost dogs and leftover zucchinis, erupted in a way that made me slightly uneasy. People began sharing photos of their own non-compliant decks and lawns, and the thread became a chorus of, what are they going to cite next? The funny thing about bureaucracy is that it's very easily lampooned. When people see the same ruler used arbitrarily, they begin to mock the ruler. Karen took the mockery personally. She responded by doubling down on process, sending out yet another email that implied the board had received new allegations and that it would now consider interim penalties, including fines. She was explicit this time. Fines would be levied immediately if the board found non-compliance during their inspections. This was escalation into something painful. Fines meant money, and money meant taking the fight beyond gossip. It was at that moment I decided to pull in the heavy artillery. Records and procedural pressure. Elena helped draft formal public record requests for all correspondences pertaining to the complaints about my cabin. Under state law, HOA communications about association business between board members can be considered public records when they involve municipal entities or when public funds are involved. But even when they're purely private, evidence of pattern can be called into small claims if you can show consistent selective enforcement. The postal letters, the emails, the internal minutes each could reveal whether Karen had a habit of targeting people she disliked. Marco suggested a digital angle, metadata. Photos have hidden data that show when and where they were taken. Emails can be traced for headers and forwarding paths. If the board had colluded to create anonymous complaints, traces would be left. We began to build a timeline. Each time Karen made a house call, I marked it on a map. Each time she sent an email, I downloaded it into an archive with timestamps. Each time she threatened a fine, I printed the notice and logged it in duplicate. The important thing was to make the paper trail thicker than her rhetoric. We also started to publicize the basic facts in a way that would prevent the board from making private, unrecorded decisions. I contacted the county ombudsman to ask about the limits of HOA enforcement, framing it not as a complaint against Karen personally, but as a question about process. The county replied with an informational packet that they sent to every homeowner in Heron Pines, copied for transparency. It was a small, bureaucratic thing, a brochure, but it landed like a bucket of cold water on the board's inflated sense of autonomy. In private, Karen fumed. I saw it on the neighborhood forum. She posted a long, self-righteous diatribe about defending our covenants and preserving property values. People replied with cynical emoji and, in Ruth's case, a firm "thank you for keeping the neighborhood safe," which likely caused Karen more internal grief than any legal challenge. The moment that helped crystallize the case happened one rainy Thursday morning when a neighbor, out of nervous habit, left her camera pointed toward the board's table during a working session she had been invited to under the guise of reviewing community calendars. The neighbor Sam, a soft-spoken architectural photographer, did not intend to record the session, but the camera's auto-upload feature had been inadvertently enabled. The result was a 10-minute audio file that included Karen talking about getting rid of certain owners who don't fit our vision, followed by instructions to file things anonymously, and we'll see how fast they move. It was the kind of offhand cruelty that makes powers abuse visible. No formal complaints, no proper notices, just a plan to weaponize gossip and anonymous notes. Sam gave me the file with a sheepish apology and a quiet, "I didn't mean to get this, but..." The 10 minutes were everything. Hearing Karen's voice admit to a strategy of anonymous complaints, of cherry-picking enforcement to fit a social agenda, made the abstract suddenly damning. It also changed the risk equation. Up to that point, we had been doing the patient work of records and procedure. With the audio file in hand, backed by time-stamped photographs and a logbook signed by real people, we had the components for a public reveal. We could either use them privately in small claims court, or we could broadcast them in a meeting where Karen had already shown her love of the stage. I chose the latter, for reasons both practical and aesthetic. If the goal was to restore peace to my cabin, the goal beyond that was to make sure no one else in Heron Pines ever suffered a similar private reign by a self-appointed monarch. The plan wasn't to humiliate for its own sake. It was to show a clear pattern: Karen's abuse of process, her misuse of anonymity, her threats of fines without cause. If the board wanted my cabin, they'd have to prove it in a forum that required them to show their work, and if they couldn't, they'd be exposed. The next meeting was called as a special hearing. This time, the attendance was record-breaking. People came with notepads and phone cameras. I sat in the front with the evidence in a manila folder, while Sam placed his inadvertently recorded file onto a small thumb drive. 10 minutes of recorded offhand cruelty is not cinematic on its own. It's mundane and human and therefore potent. I knew the sound of Karen's voice would carry weight. So would the image of her reading an emergency order she had themselves authored. We were no longer collecting. We were about to reveal. The night before the hearing, sleep refused to be practical. I spread the materials across my kitchen table, aligning them with the sort of careful geometry lawyers use when they prep for trial. Photos to the left, timestamps to the right, the porch logbook in the middle, like a well-worn evidence placard. Marco came over with a thermos and a grin that was trying to be confident for the two of us. He'd helped me compress the metadata into a readable timeline and had even mocked up a simple slideshow that would play on any phone if needed. "Hungry for a little theater?" he asked. You have to admit, it's satisfying when the puppeteer trips over their own strings. I had thought about that metaphor so much I'd grown fond of it. The trick of the plan was not to be flashy, but to be methodical. We rehearsed what I would say. The opening line had to be calm and precise. "I'm here to request a formal and documented justification for the emergency order restricting beach use adjacent to my property." That sentence would force the board to either produce proof or to demonstrate their failure to follow procedure. Either way, the board's arrogance became clearer. We double-checked the small things: spare batteries, printed copies of the complaint the board had issued, a notarized copy of my property's survey showing the communal beach access. Elena provided a short legal memo on arbitrary enforcement, just enough to make the legal principles plain without feeling like courtroom bluster. We also had a public relations advantage. Tom, the retired journalist, had announced he would attend the hearing and ask questions about the board's communications, a gentle but effective threat that turned bureaucratic cover into potential front-page news. We were not alone, and that would drive up the cost of Karen's theatrics. When I arrived at the community hall the next evening, the room was buzzing. People had lined folding chairs, theater-style, like an audience waiting for a play. Karen sat in the chair at the front, flanked by her usual satellites, but something was different in her demeanor. She was smaller somehow, as though the weight of an audience had translated her performance into vulnerability. The meeting opened with the usual procedural stuff: tattooed minutes, muttered agreements, but when Karen attempted to read the emergency order aloud, I interrupted with my prepared statement. I delivered the sentence we'd rehearsed and then asked, politely, for the board to detail the specific complaints with dates, times, and supporting documentation. Karen's response was the sort of thing we've all seen before, a parade of vague claims. "We've received reports," she began. "There have been concerns raised about. The list never materialized into names or dates. It was theater, so I moved to the next step. I asked for a vote to rescind the emergency order pending formal review because the order had been issued without the quorum documentation required by our bylaws. People were watching. The public interest made procedure matter in ways it hadn't when the board met in private. This was the moment we'd precariously set up. Either the board would produce their anonymous complainants or they would be shown to have acted unilaterally. Karen, to her credit, tried to steer the audience. She accused me of badgering and suggested I was seeking attention. That complaint would have been funny if it weren't so telling. She was, quite literally, accusing a homeowner of being unreasonable for demanding paperwork. I asked the room instead to recognize a simple fact. When a governing body acts, it must document why. The county brochure we had all received was suddenly relevant. Tom, the journalist, rose and asked Karen a straightforward question. "Can you cite the complainants and the dates and provide copies?" Karen's answer was a study in evasiveness. "There have been various submissions. We are complying." Tom followed up. "Are these submissions documented?" Silence for a beat. Then, the small, accidental sound that changes bureaucratic math. Sam's camera was on, and his accidental 10-minute recording played across the room. It was raw, the sound of people speaking as though behind closed doors, the cadence of conspiratorial cruelty. Karen's voice said things about getting rid of certain owners and files and anonymous complaints. The room's air shifted from curious to electric. You could see the moment switches flicked on in people's faces, incredulity, then anger, then a sort of practical amusement. Karen's face, once so practiced, tightened. She attempted to explain the recording away as taken out of context. The context, of course, was the conversation itself. It wasn't out of context when it was her voice. The board tried to recover with ritual. They declared the recording inadmissible. They cited privacy. The irony at the heart of that argument was that the board had been using privacy as both weapon and cloak. Privacy to intimidate neighbors with threats that would never be publicly recorded, and privacy to shield their own planning. Now the recording stripped that away. A neighbor, who had been silent until now, demanded the immediate resignation of the board until a full and impartial review could be conducted. The motion passed with a surprising margin. It was the kind of ordinary justice you feel when a community collectively shrugs off a bad habit. Karen reacted as I expected, with outrage, because she believed outrage would intimidate the wavering. She stormed out, leaving the board in disarray. But her furious exit was a catalyst, not a solution. The board's institutional problems remained. Legal processes had to be observed. The meeting's minutes were formally recorded. A motion was made to appoint an interim committee to oversee the investigation into the board's actions, comprised of 3 homeowners and 1 neutral attorney recommended by the county. The interim committee's first act was to request all internal communications between board members pertaining to the complaint about my cabin. That request was the surgical incision. The responses came in over the next week in the form of emails and minutes once again, actual documents instead of theatrical claims, and they told a story. There were forwards of anonymous complaints, with little notes from Karen suggesting a pattern of targeting. There were suggestions that unnamed homeowners be the subject of a campaign to make them look like the problem. The more documents arrived, the more the case that Karen had weaponized process grew. Now the HOA wasn't just an abstract board, it was an employer of methodical harassment. The interim committee moved with a quiet firmness that I found almost antithetical to how the board had operated. They issued a draft resolution recommending censure for using anonymous complaints as policy, proposed a schedule for restitutive measures, including rescinded fines if any had been levied, and recommended a town hall where every homeowner could petition the board or the interim committee. The effect was immediate and measurable. Karen's power, which had always depended on a perception of inevitability, cracked. Her allies retreated. The dishonest idea that community standards required vigilante enforcement lost its gloss when the transcripts and emails were read aloud by volunteers at a town hall. The public had dignity. The board had memos. There was a small, delicious irony in watching the very mechanism she had used meetings, votes, the casually ignored rulebook be used against her. But the best part was not the humiliation, it was the practical victory. The emergency order was rescinded, the fines were suspended. The interim committee recommended a code of clear, written procedures for handling complaints, including a ban on accepting anonymous allegations unless there was corroborating evidence of harm. Hoc tyranny had been replaced by process. Karen did not accept it gracefully. She filed a complaint against me for harassment of board members and for malicious recording. We learned then something else. When a person is cornered by procedure they don't care for, they reach for any available mechanism to regain control. Karen's complaint was, in its own way, predictable and small. But it pushed the matter into a domain we had to be careful with the possibility of legal action. That's where my old professional life became useful in ways I'd hoped wouldn't be necessary. I knew how to respond to a formal complaint that was thin on specifics and thick on performative examples. I wrote back with careful, neutral language. Deny the allegations, request evidence, and submit a counter-complaint for selective enforcement. In that response, I also included the porch logbook and the timeline of photos. The interim committee, obliged by legal prudence to remain neutral, forwarded both the complaint and my response to a pro bono mediator. The mediation was scheduled a month out, giving us the time to gather more public support and to make sure the record was undeniably clear that the board had been bullies, not guardians. The mediation itself was an exercise in bureaucratic catharsis. Karen arrived with a lawyer she'd found through a neighbor's recommendation. I arrived with Tom, Elena, Marco, and a stack of documents. The mediator, a retired judge with a gravelly laugh and the patience of a saint, listened. He listened to Karen's claims about defending standards and to my calm recitations of procedure. He listened to neighbors who spoke, one by one, about being called on by Karen in ways that felt like personal interrogations. Hearing everyone's experiences out loud turned knee-jerk obedience into collective testimony. By the end of the mediation, it was clear that the legal claim against me had no teeth. The mediator proposed a settlement. The board would withdraw the complaint, rescind the emergency order, implement formal complaint procedures, and Karen would step down from certain oversight roles, pending independent review. It was a practical, business-like resolution that did not produce a villain's grand arrest, but instead achieved the thing that mattered. The intimidation tactics would be dismantled, and a structure of transparency would replace secrecy. The victory felt, in its quiet way, enormous. It was the sort of justice that doesn't need theatrical fireworks. It only needs the steady light of procedure and the tenacity to keep shining it on the subject until facts show what rhetoric obscured. Karen helped contribute to that clarity by making self-incriminating comments during the mediation, which were placed on the record. It was, in the end, a slow unmasking. One by one, the masks dropped, and the faces underneath showed the petty human things they were: fear, ego, the desire to belong at the top of the social ladder. The community of Heron Pines, for its part, surprised me. Most people didn't want to be dramatic. They wanted fair rules and the ability to picnic in peace. What they didn't want was to live under a person who turned the HOA into a means of controlling who belonged. The interim committee implemented reforms, a transparent complaint process, a clause forbidding retaliatory actions by board members, training sessions about the limits of HOA power. They even instituted a small whistleblower procedure, so anonymous complaints could be vetted rather than weaponized. It was the sort of reform you think about in dry textbooks, but the effect was tangible. The neighborhood returned to something like normal. I painted a small accent stripe on my trim, not because I had to, but because the whole ridiculous thing felt like a proper punctuation mark. The cabin smelled of cedar again, and the lake happened in the way it always had: loons undisturbed, kids yelling as they jumped off docks, the small, comforting noise of conversation. Karen's long-term fate was less cinematic. She didn't disappear in scandal or court. What happened to her was more subtle. Her authority evaporated. People who had once deferred to her began to ask questions, and when she answered with the old tones of command, people simply stopped listening. She kept her title for a while because the mechanics of replacing a board member require more than annoyance. They require a vote. But the culture had shifted. For years, People had been conditioned to avoid conflict and let officers act unchecked. The crisis we endured taught us to hold our agents accountable. That was, in its own quiet way, a monumental change. As for me, I found that the peace I had sought at the cabin was restored, but it had come with a cost. I had been dragged back into civic life, and I had found it more useful and satisfying than I'd expected. I had used my legal training and my small technical hobbies as tools not to punish, but to make visible what had been hidden. The work was not cruel. It was methodical and proportional. The moral I tell people now over coffee on my deck, with the porch log visible as an ironic memento, is simple. Bureaucracy, like any tool, can be wielded for good or for harm. If you don't insist on clear, recorded processes, you invite arbitrariness. And when arbitrariness arises, document everything. Keep receipts and timestamps, and don't be afraid to ask for proof. The final scene of the whole saga wasn't a dramatic court victory. It was a community meeting where a new set of bylaws was read aloud by volunteers, each clause written plainly and voted on publicly. Karen attended and sat in the back. She didn't speak. Some things, you realize, time and transparency change. After the bylaws passed, I packed up my camera and my router and walked the short trail to the dock, where my friends were already setting up a modest bonfire, the sort we'd always had. Not the board's theatrical bonfires with a guest list vetted by a tyrant. Someone handed me a cup of coffee. The loons sounded across the lake as if nothing had happened. I sat down and smiled. The victory tasted like ordinary life. It was quiet, patient, and steadfast. I'd won not by humiliating someone for pleasure, but by forcing a structure that had allowed a bully to bloom into sunlight. If there's a takeaway beyond the procedural, it's this. Power seated in habit is fragile when confronted with evidence and public attention. People who depend on authority without accountability often trip over their own eagerness. If you want to prevent someone from running your community like a private court, you don't fight fire with more fire. You fight it with records, procedure, and the courage to ask for a chain of custody. For me, that chain led to a small drawer where I keep old cabin keys and a copy of the porch log, a ridiculous, silly artifact and an important reminder that small acts of documentation can be the most effective defense against petty tyranny. So here's my question to you. If you live under a small board or a quiet authority that makes decisions in shadows, what would you document first? The cup of coffee steamed in my palms, and the heat seeped into my skin like a quiet, domestic blessing. The loons were still calling, a liquid, distant sound that threaded through reeds and the occasional pop from the bonfire. My friends had lined up chairs on the weathered dock, their faces lit by both flame and that slow, relieved happiness that follows a fight you win without becoming the thing you fought. Someone nudged a guitar into my lap. I handed it back because tonight the music could be a low, private thing, not a statement. I wanted to listen more than I wanted to make noise. I thought of the copy of the porch log tucked into the drawer with the cabin keys. A small, ridiculous thing, yes, ink faded at the edges, entries written in different hands, a blot where someone had spilled syrup 3 summers ago. But there was a gravity to it I hadn't expected. The log was a map of small, ordinary permissions and refusals, of who had pushed a canoe into the water and who had borrowed the ladder. It documented a way of living together that no smooth corporate policy could capture. That log had been the hinge on which the whole thing turned. It had been both absurd and irreproachable, a tiny human artifact that refused to be subsumed by an aura of authority. "It feels like the old summers," Tom said, leaning back so his shoulders could touch the night. He took a sip from a thermos and exhaled the smell of peppermint and smoke. No velvet ropes needed. "Don't jinx it," I said. The words were half joke, half prayer. The sense of precariousness hadn't left me. It rarely does after you pull apart a mechanism of power and see what's inside. You never unsee the crack where impunity worked its way in. You only make it harder for that crack to widen. "You did well," Marla said. Her voice had a careful modulation, the kind that comes from a municipal planner who had learned to be gentle with triumph. She'd been my ally from the first complaint, the quiet engine in many meetings, the woman who had cross-checked minutes against memories and made polite, surgical inquiries that left tyrants flustered. Her thumbs were still ink-stained from revising the bylaws late into the night. "You exposed a pattern and you made it ordinary. That's the trick. Pattern. Ordinary. Those were the words I kept returning to. Because the villainy had been banal, a sequence of unchecked favors, a habit of glossing over objections, a charisma that compensated for competence. What made it dangerous wasn't any single decision. It was the cumulative weight of decisions made in private, the habit of assuming that private preferences declared by a charismatic authority were the equivalent of law. "Do you think she'll come?" Karen sat a few chairs away, her hands folded in her lap. Her hair had a silver thread now, and the faint tremor in her fingers suggested a small, contained grief. She hadn't said a word in the meeting, hadn't needed to. Her silence had been a presence on its own, a kind of quiet testimony that said more than argument sometimes could. I let the question hang. "She might," I said finally. "She's the type to test the water before she speaks, or to show up and try to charm everyone with a baked good." Karen let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh. Neither of us had anything to prove to her. The bylaws were a public record now. They had been read aloud, read back by volunteers, debated and amended with an insistence on plain language. That process had been the whole point. If something in the rules favored one person over another, that favor had to be justified in the light of a community's voice. If you can't justify it, you can't keep it. Simple as that. The bonfire popped and sent a brief shower of sparks up into the night like a private meteor shower. The smoke had that sweet, resinous smell of cedar, and it pooled low and thick before the wind took it away. Someone tossed marshmallows on sticks. Someone else produced a thermos of something stronger. I watched faces open, rumpled, modestly triumphant, and felt the slow, luminous satisfaction of work completed not for glory, but for use. "What's next?" Marla asked, more to herself than to anyone. She had a habit of framing questions out loud, as if to ensure they took form in the air where we could all hold them. Her planner's brain was already moving toward the future. The bylaws would be a beginning, not a safety blanket. Systems required maintenance. Habits needed reinforcement. People, especially the kind of people who liked to be in charge, tended to adjust. "What I want," I said, and the words came steady, careful, "is to turn all this into muscle. Not law alone, but practice. We need onboarding orientation for new board members and volunteers. We need a chain of custody for records that even a charming, determined bully can't weasel around. We need training on conflict of interest and an enforcement committee that's not someone's crony." Marla nodded, as if the ideas were stepping stones she could already see. A training module, a short video, and a one-page guide, no more than one page, on what counts as a documented decision and how to capture it, make it part of every annual meeting. "Simple," Tom said. He loved simplicity the way a carpenter loves a good plane. It made his hands move cleanly. "One page, plain language, a checklist." "Plain language," Karen repeated. Her voice had a new resolve to it. She stared into the fire, as if the flicker mapped out the geometry of the coming months for her. "And if she tries to weasel, we have a community watch. Not snooping," she added quickly, aware of how that phrase could be twisted, "but transparency. We document, we ask. We ask for receipts." Her eyes met mine across the firelight, and there was a brief, almost shy exchange of gratitude. We had both been small cogs in a machine that had rattled when it broke, and now we were choosing to be the hands that tightened things back up. "Speaking of receipts," I said, leaning forward so my voice dropped, "there may be more to find. You remember Mr. Ellis at the marina? He said he'd kept copies of some correspondence that didn't look official, but that might show patterns. I haven't had a chance to follow up." Marla's face lit up at that prospect. "Another data point? Good. Bring it in. If we can triangulate more instances, we can preempt future abuse." "We should also think about outreach," Tom added. "Not just for the community that shows up at meetings, but for the people who, for whatever reason, stay away. Older folks. Newcomers. Seasonal renters. Make it easy for them to participate." I felt the weight and worth of what we were planning. This wasn't just bylaws and logs, it was culture. Culture shifts are slow and messy, and easy to enunciate and hard to make habitual. But we'd already seen how small acts like a porch log could set off a cascade. If we made the habit visible and routine, if we made documentation the default human move instead of an optional bureaucratic gymnastics, we had a shot. "Okay," I said. "We build the training modules. We digitize the records in a way that's accessible but secure. We set up a volunteer oversight committee with staggered terms. We invite Mr. Ellis and anyone else who might shed light on the pattern of favors. We make it obnoxiously hard for anyone to claim an ad hoc privilege. Someone whistled low from the back of the dock. Obnoxiously hard, Tom repeated, smiling. I like the spirit. It was a good spirit to have in your pocket, the righteous kind that doesn't collapse into relish for ruin. I didn't want to revel in Karen's fall, if fall it was. I wanted something sturdier, a community that could not be easily farmed by a single personality. The phone vibration in my pocket was an unwanted intrusion, then a small relief. It was a message from the local paper asking if I would do a follow-up interview. They wanted to talk about the bylaws and the community's reaction. I considered their question for a moment. Public attention was a double-edged sword. It could cement the change by making it public. It could also give the old authorities a stage to posture. But if the media coverage focused on the mechanics, the clear, weirdly human importance of checks and receipts, then it could be a teaching moment. Do it, Marla said before I decided. Frame it on process. Use the porch log as a prop. Make people see that it's not about revenge. It's about making sure we all get a fair turn. That was the line I wanted to hold. The satisfaction of vindication is sweet but corrosive if turned too often into spectacle. I wanted the narrative we spun to be about something practical and replicable. How many communities had been taken advantage of because they had no records? How many neighborhood associations had become fiefdoms because nobody thought to ask for the minutes? The pattern recurred more often than you'd think. A charismatic person, a lack of documentation, a habit of private decision-making. Look at the mess this particular kind of arrogance makes, Karen said softly. It isn't loud. It's like mold. You only see it after it's eaten the corner of the ceiling. Mold. The metaphor fit. Mold is a slow, insidious thing. You can scrape it off the paint, but not remove the cause until you change airflow and humidity. Our bylaws, orientation, training, those were the architecture and the ventilation, not just the paint. The night deepened. The fire dwindled to a steady pool of embers. We talked in fragments, then commitments. Who would draft the one-page guide? Who would set up the digital archive? Who would call Mr. Ellis? I scribbled notes on the back of an old receipt I found in my pocket. Habits die hard. The ink smudged at the edges in the damp air, but the words were clear enough. Checklist, 1 page, volunteers, outreach, triangulate Ellis. At one point, a deer wandered near the tree line, watching us with those big, patient eyes animals have for humans. It moved with the soft confidence of a creature that understands its role in the night's economy. Eat, watch, go. The world of the dock felt centered and fragile and complete in a way I hadn't felt in months. Later, when we packed up chairs and tossed the last coals into the lake, symbols matter, but we left no scorched symbols on shore. We walked back up the trail together. The ground underfoot was spongy with pine needles. The air smelled like wet earth and the faint metallic tang of someone who had cut cedar for kindling. Karen kept to herself, a few steps behind, and I could sense her listening. There are moments when words aren't required. Presence is enough. Can I ask you something? She said, as we reached the break in the pines where the community road rejoined the paved lane. Ask. My voice was steady, even though my heart had a residual flutter. There is always a tiny adrenaline hangover after a public fight. Why did you do it? She didn't mean why bother, she asked with a more existential curiosity. Why risk going to the meeting, dragging all this out? I looked up at the sky. The stars were a thin wash of light. There was no moon, so the night felt like a charcoal drawing. I thought of the porch log, of the complaints that had begun as only a small irritation, of the way administrative injustices accumulate like lint in a dryer, small, unseen, then suffocating. I don't like being told what I must accept without evidence, I said honestly, and I don't like to see someone define a community by their personal whim, but it's more than that. I wanted to make sure the thing we love, the lake, the shared docks, the idea that our lives intersect gently wasn't privatized into a court for someone's ego. We can be better at being together. I wanted that to be a practice, not an artifact. She nodded slowly. The answer satisfied something in her. And if she comes back trying to be charming? Then we ask for receipts, I said, and we both laughed, because it was funny, even though it was true. The laugh loosened something else. Not gloating, not victory dance, but an honest readiness to keep being awake. We parted at the little wooden sign that marked the turn into the cul-de-sac of the cabins. She hugged me in that brief, neighborly way that holds thanks and keeps distance. I walked the few steps to my car with the sensation of a job that had a breathing space around it now. We had not finished everything. We had set up the scaffolding for a healthier community. We had not yet nailed the last boards. My phone buzzed again. A short message from Mr. Ellis. Have copies. Come by tomorrow morning early. Tease on. It was the kind of invitation that promised more small revelations, a paper trail, a scrap of an email, a forwarded message with weirdly helpful details. I smiled. The porch log had opened a door. Old, bureaucratic things often have more veins running through them than the first glance suggests. Before I went to sleep that night, I opened the drawer and felt the old keys like relics. The porch log lay on top like an ordinary book. I turned a page and found a scrawl that made me chuckle. If you take the ladder, you owe coffee. Someone had added a little sun drawing at the end. Habit, humor, responsibility, all folded together into a small culture. That was what we had fought to keep ordinary. There were practical follow-ups to do in the morning, drafts to write, volunteers to recruit. There were staff trainings to plan and a media interview to craft. There was also a softer, more important work to make recording and asking part of the way we loved one another in public. It was the difference between living under a personality and living in a shared world. I drifted to sleep with the sound of loons in my ears and a quiet certainty that we were on the right side of a small historical tilt. The victory tonight tasted like ordinary life: coffee, cedar smoke, shared conversation. It was not the headline we deserved, nor the court decree. It was the hum of people making things right together, an unglamorous, stubborn kinship that would, if tended, keep mold from finding the joints again. Tomorrow would be another day. There would be more documents, more interviews, more small battles over phrases in bylaws that felt both legalistic and sacred, because the words we choose to live by shape our lives. I was ready, not because I wanted to be a hero, because I wanted to be a neighbor who keeps receipts and asks kindly for proof. That, in the end, was the quiet revolution I wanted to encourage.